Hey guys, Ryu here, welcome back, and this one we're gonna be talking about rendering. I'll show you everything you need to know about camera, about render settings, and how to frame it. Now if you see that I already framed this image, and I want to talk you through it and explain why this image is framed like that. I'm gonna be talking about every single detail that you need to know to create good framings. Now mind you, it's gonna take some time for you to learn how to see a good framing, but that just comes through practice and studies, so there's no way around it. But I'm gonna try to explain you as best I can and help you out with with the basics. So in case of this this framing, we are talking about a very long focal length, so we are at 250 mil, and our depth of field actually is 1.4. You can't see it in here because I reset it, but we're going to be talking about that. Now if I show you the image I created with this framing, which is this one, you can see that and there's a bit of a blur here in the back. So the focal length simply matches the idea I had in my head. I knew I want to add background in Photoshop, I knew I want to blur it, I want to create a cinematic, very dramatic and intimate close-up of this drone, kind of like a frame from a movie. Very dramatic and very and there's a lot of energy in this. There's a great closeness to the exiting edge of the frame. I'm gonna explain everything to you in a minute. The focal length, normal focal length in Blender is 50 millimeters. So if I'm gonna leave camera view and I'm gonna go here, you'll see that the way I'm looking at this model is very different. It's about 50 mil. Let me just collapse this. So if I'm going to go to end panel and go to view, you'll see that 50 millimeters is the default focal length. Now the reason why it's 50 is because that's how we humans see the world naturally. Our eyes see at about 50 mil magnification. So this will be very natural for us to look at this drone in real life. That's how it would look. Okay, this is also why a lot of street photography is done in 50 mil, because it simply looks very natural. So now by extending the focal length to slightly higher, so if I go to end panel, you can by the way do it in here as well, and making it, for example, 135, you will see that my compression of the image is going to change. The image looks a little bit different now, and the reason for that is because focal length, when you increase it, it compresses the view. Okay, this is going to make this a little bit more distorted, and longer focal length is going to compress it, which is why I chose such a long focal length for my render. Okay, let's talk about different ways of framing. Okay, you could frame this from many different angles, all right, and let me just talk you through it. So let's go to, let's say, 85 mil, which is a standard focal length for portrait, and I treat this drone as a portrait because I treat most of my renders as a portrait, but this one specifically because it has a clear face. We as a human gonna be drawn to faces. We're gonna recognize eyes and mouth and everything immediately. That's why you can sometimes see on internet pictures with like a garbage can with two like some circular things on it and some kind of a gap, and it looks like a face, because we see faces everywhere, and that's just a human thing. Okay, so this is gonna be a very, very, very strong focal point because it looks like a face. So you can frame it in many different ways. You can frame it like this. Let me just go to look that very quickly. It's going to be a faster feedback. So let's see that. This is a really interesting angle. Okay, looking at this drone from bottom, there's a lot of detail. There would be a lot of negative space even if you went 21:9 framing, which is, by the way, the same framing I'm going for in here, because if you go here to output, you will see that my resolution is 3440 by 1440, which is 21:9 ratio. Unlike most of the images are in 16:9, I like the cinematic view. It kind of emulates the large screen ratio, which is I think 23:9 by the way, but that's close enough. So anyway, let's go back here, and this could be an interesting framing, showing a lot of details, right? You could frame it from the back like this. Okay, this is also interesting, something like this, right? You could frame it from the top, like this. Okay, You could frame it from a front, dead on, okay, orthographic. You could frame it from a back, orthographic. You could frame it, you know, from a back like this. This is also interesting, okay. This is an interesting frame. Of course, the lighting would need to change, but the framing is kind of cool, right? This, you know, this could be an interesting framing as well, like that, you see. So you can have all kinds of different framings that you want, especially when your model looks decent from any angle that you're going to shoot from. So if you're, for example, shooting it from a portfolio, you want to shoot from different angles because you want to show different, you know, different views and different looks of your model. This could also be a good framing like this, right? Something like this, you see. This looks like a portrait. A bit sad because it's looking down. So you can create even different moods by just changing camera angle, which is very powerful, okay? This is shooting slightly upwards, which means the camera is below the horizon line of the model. So it's below the model, which means it's empowering the model. Also, it creates an illusion as if the model was slightly tilted to the right, so kind of turning to the right, if you know what I mean. That's just an illusion. That's what perspective is actually creating here, and the relation between the rotors. So it kind of looks like he was sort of, you know, slightly turning to the right, so away from the camera. But that's an illusion. Now I strategically cut off these fins, so this is really important. I cut these fins out. Even this bit here is slightly cut out. I'm probably gonna be removing this in Photoshop because it's really distracting. We don't need that. So I probably would remove this in Photoshop. In fact, I think I even did. No, I didn't actually. I left it in. Interesting. But probably removing this wouldn't be a bad idea. So, you know, just saying. So I might actually remove that when we're gonna be editing. The only thing I'm not crazy about is that the gun is overlapping with the rotor here. I would prefer if there was a little bit more gap. So sort of like, you know, sort of like this, right? So there's a bit more gap here. And I think this would also hide this wing here. The only problem is that when I do that, the body of these drones is gonna be shorter, because look at that. This is longer, this is shorter. So the perspective is different on both shots. So we could try that, you know, if I grab this camera and move it a little bit to the bottom, I would lose this, you know, this information here, this flow. So this tail will be hidden behind this rotor. You're probably gonna be a little bit different of a feel, but you know, we could try that. So we could just page down and lock to view, and we could just slightly move our camera, you know, slightly move our camera like this. This would also be, you know, a valuable solution, right? The only problem is, like I said, you're gonna switch this perspective here, which is, you know, gonna look slightly different to what we had here. So, you know, I think this is just a little bit, maybe a little bit better, but that's just me, okay? We have a very strong element here, but this element is gonna be outweighed by the face, because face is extremely powerful. There's also a lot of details here, so there is a very strong pull in this area, a very strong pull on a gun too. But this is also quite a powerful area. It takes, you know, like 1/4 of the image, like 25%, which is quite big. There's gonna be a room for logo here, a room for logo here, which is why I put logos in here. Bottom should be just left alone. There's a less space above the eyes than below the drone. There's more grounding space for it. The crop is really aggressive. If you could look into portraiture and the way, for example, I frame my work, I usually show people examples how I do that, because there's actually good study. You see that the distance between the eyes and the top is much smaller than the distance between the chin and the bottom. There's always more room in here, so it doesn't feel claustrophobic. Cropping images is a quite difficult thing to do. It just requires a lot of practice, and sometimes if you crop too much or too little, it's just going to look a bit off. But cropping is very powerful because it brings image and the face closer to your camera, looks a bit more intimate, and that's why also usually with cropping you use higher depth of field to amplify this feeling of closeness. Okay, so when you do that, you see that the background usually is just a mist, but you can see that again. Most of the time the distance between the top of an eye and the bottom from the chin is larger on the bottom than on the top, because this just looks a bit more natural. And every single image you will see has the same ratio. You know, the distance here is smaller than the distance here. So it's just, you know, it comes with practice. Like I said, cropping is really difficult, but you know, you know, you just have to practice it. There is no other way around it. Okay, you have to keep practicing until you get good at it. But look at portraits, look at how portraits are lit and how portraits are cropped, and you will learn how to do this. This face is very close to the frame. This is an exiting edge of the frame, which means the drone faces to the left, and this is an exiting left edge of the frame. It's really close. I did leave some breathing space in here, but it's really close. And the reason why I could get away with it is because there's a lot of data here, and there's the negative space here is quite filled, and also the eye is going to be pulled back, and this rotor makes this image very, very, I mean this area of the image very important. So you're going to be actually drawn across this entire image, and that's why I could get away with getting this face so close to the edge. But normally, if you look at my images, there's usually more space here than here. But then again, if you shoot faces, you don't have any data behind the face, whereas in this case we have all this data here. So this is why I could get away with this. If there was nothing in here, no elements, I would never frame this like that. But because we have this information here, this is, you know, the left side is fine. Okay, so that's important. Now let's talk about lighting, because lighting is crucial. Let's go to cycles and let's go to film. Let's turn off transparent and let's go to cycles here, and I want to show you, you know, I want to show you a bit more about this render. Now the lighting is coming from behind the drone, and that's really important, which means we are shooting against the light. Okay, light is coming from there. Even if it's very diffused, there is still a slightly directional light here, and we're shooting against light, which is why we could create this kind of a very dynamic and aggressive image. You can easily change that by going to your camera views, Control 0. Let's change this to to EV, because it's going to be faster. And what I'm going to now, go here, click and drag, and switch to shading view. So shader editor, and go to world. You'll see we have these nodes. If you didn't add them yet, simply click here, Control T with node wrangler add-on enabled. Remember, I told you to enable node wrangler here, so you have to go to add-ons and enable node wrangler. Okay, this add-on, and you add these, and when you add them with Control T, you click here and you add your HDRI. And then what you can do in Eevee, you can rotate it. Okay, so watch this. If I'm gonna go here to rotation on Z, I can rotate my image, and with this image the light's gonna rotate. Now there's a very important thing I need to tell you. If you're gonna be rotating light, make sure you're gonna be rotating light in camera view, because the light's gonna look completely different, okay, depending on where you look from. Because when you look from here, the light will look different than from the camera perspective. So when you change the lighting, always look through the camera every time. Okay, every time when you finish working with your lights, look through the camera. And remember that the way it looks in Eevee gonna be completely different than how it looks in cycles. You see the difference, right? So it's important to check cycles afterwards, and you can turn it off. Now we're gonna be rendering this in transparent view, meaning I don't want the background to show, because I want to edit my own background in Photoshop, which I'm going to show you how to do later on. Okay, so that's really important as well. Now in this case, we're going to be using only one source of light. You could add another source of light if you wanted to. I'm not going to be doing that. We're going to keep it very simple. In this case, one HDRI is fine. We're quite okay with that. And also because this lighting in the HDRI is very diffused, it's going through the clouds, it's very diffused, falls on the object from many different angles because it's being reflected by the clouds. So the clouds act like a massive light box basically, and kind of diffuse all the light coming from the sun. So this is why we can get away with one HDRI. If this was a sunset, this part would be almost pitch black because we're shooting against the sunset, which is quite bright. Okay, so what we find here now, let's talk about one more time about settings here. You can see my settings for the output. Also, output is important. We're going to be shooting into TIFF 16-bit RGBA. We need RGBA because A stands for alpha, which is the transparency of the background. And so that's that. Under passes here, in this tab, so under the view layer properties, you want to enable denoising data because we're going to be using compositing. I'm going to be talking about it in a second. And here under light paths, you want to copy my settings, but you can go lower than that if you want to. You could go 8, 6, 6, and then 4, 4. Or you could just go with my values, which is a bit higher. So it's 12, 8, 8, 8, 8. Now in our case, I'm going to be rendering decals, which means I need both transparent and transmission, and 8 simply gives me a bit better quality. If you're gonna go to 0 here, you're gonna see like squares around your decals because the alpha background of the decals will not be transparent, so this is important. In terms of samples, it's very easy. 250 samples, that's enough. We don't really need the noise because we're gonna be using the noise through compositing, so you don't need that. And in compositing, if you enable the denoising data, you can see these are gonna appear. You will not see these at the beginning. All you will see is basically nothing. You need to click here to see these two popping out, and then you simply Shift A and you add the noise. Okay, so you're gonna add this one, and then we're gonna add glare, which is responsible for bloom, and we need bloom because we have rotors and they flashy, so we need to bloom them out. So we're gonna connect normal to normal, albedo to albedo, and we're going to switch from streaks to fog glow and change to high, and that's it. Right, we're not using volumetric, so we don't have to worry about anything else. Let's go back to layout, and this is, you know, all you need to know. Now the last thing is performance. Now here on the performance, you need to set the tile size, which is basically how many tiles they're gonna be rendered. So if you're gonna, by default is 64. I would suggest setting it to 256 at the beginning and seeing how it performs. If you have a card that is 1080 GTX or above, you're probably going to be okay with 1024. I'm using 390, so I'm going to be using 2048, but you know, it really depends on your machine, you know, the settings here, right? So you need to just play with it and check what works for you, but I would suggest starting with 256. That usually works best for any setup, so you know, try with that. Here on the settings, we're using CUDA, but you could switch to optics if you wanted to. So I'm using only card. Usually selecting both slows down your renders. Even with my PC, you can see it's quite powerful. It's gonna be slower than just on the card, so I would just leave it unchecked. You could go to optics if you wanted to. Sometimes I used to get Pythons, but I don't know, I haven't tried optics on this 3.0. Actually, we could try this and see how it's gonna go. Save preferences, and let's see how this is gonna go. So we're going to go to our render settings, cycles, of course, GPU compute always, that's important, and then I think we are fine. We can close this, I can actually open the samples, and we're good to render. Now the last thing, let's talk about camera depth of field. That's really important. So if I enable this, you see that it's gonna go blurry. Now the reason why it goes blurry is because the distance is set to 10 meters, whereas this drone is probably about 70 meters away from the camera. So if I'm gonna sit to like 75, you'll see my drone's gonna become a bit more sharp. You can set your focal, you can set your focus on a specific object. Just remember that your camera will focus always on the origin point. So if your origin point is somewhere here, even though your object is in this area, it will focus on origin point. So for example, in case of this, origin point is here. Okay, so it will not focus here, it will focus on this point, so be careful. So I'm gonna choose an eye, and I'm gonna focus on an eye, which is fine. So select the camera, let's select this, and let's focus on the eye. Now I'm focusing here, okay? And then we're going to change the focal, the f-stop here. We're going to change to 1.4, which is quite aggressive with this focal length. Basically, the larger the focal length and the lower the f-stop, the more blurry you're gonna get. So for instance, if I'm gonna show you now, here the eyes are sharp, right? But already here we're falling out of focus. And back here it's gonna be quite fuzzy. If I change it to something like, for example, 2.8, we're still gonna be fuzzy on the back, but much less fuzzy, okay? But then the front is gonna be much sharper, you see? So basically how it works, okay? Let me just explain you how it works. Let's go to regular view and let me show you how it works, okay? So with our camera here, all right, let's just add the cube, right? And I'm gonna add this cube here, and I'm gonna go to orthographic, and I'm gonna rotate it, move it here, and YY. Now, focal plane, which is basically a phrase that defines what's in focus. So let's call it field of sharpness. It's going to be relative to the focal length and the f-stop, okay? The smaller the f-stop, the smaller the focal plane. So it's going to be narrower. And the focal plane, the field of focus, always goes across, so it's perpendicular to the direction at which camera is focusing. So if I'm going to move my cursor to origin, sorry, my cursor to selected, and I'm going to switch my pivot here, the field of focus will always move with the camera, okay? So if my camera is angled like this, that means my focal plane is going to go across this drone like that. So if my f-stop is very small, that means my focal plane, my focal field is very narrow. So it's going to be the eye in focus, maybe a bit of a front, and maybe this part of the rotor. The rest is going to be blurry. The higher the f-stop, okay, in my camera, the wider this area is going to become, okay? Which is why when I changed it to 0.8, this in front became sharp. So this is how it works, okay? So when you shoot at an angle, remember that this focal plane, this field of focus of sharpness, is going to cut your model at an angle. If the camera was here and I was facing it from the side, my focal plane would go like this, which means the whole side would be in focus, but this would be blurry. That's why I'm seeing a lot of errors in renders. When someone is, shooting like that, there's an element in the front and the whole thing is blurry. You guys need to understand how it works before you use it, okay? So that's how it works. So if you want to have more things in focus, make sure that you're going to increase the f-stop, or you're going to change the focal length, because focal length, there is a very strong relationship between focal length and depth of field. The higher the focal length of the lens, the more compression you're going to get, the higher the effect of depth of field you're going to get, okay? Another thing is that the closer the camera to the object and the further away the background from the object, the higher the blur on the background is going to be. So the further I go from the object, the more blurry the background is going to be. The closer I get, the less blurry it's going to be. It's logical, because you're getting closer to this area of focus. But the closer the camera to the object, the more intense the blur is going to be, because then the relation between the camera and the object distance and the background is going to be different. So if the camera was here, then the distance between the camera, then the relation between the distance of the camera to the object and object to the background changes, you see. So there's also something to bear in mind. Like I said, research photography, because photography is a key to good renders, okay? The last thing I'm going to tell you is that I would render this without background and with a background if you actually rendered background in Blender. So if I did have a background in Blender, I would be rendering this with and without background. And then I have a cutout in Photoshop, perfect cutout of my model with which I can manipulate. In addition, if you're going to be using bloom, which we do, you want to create a render without the bloom, which means you want to create a cutout render with a bloom and one without. So you want to turn off this glare, so hold Control and right mouse button, just drag to cut these nodes and remove it from the equation. So when I render, it's going to render without the bloom, and that's quite important, because if I render this right now, okay, I'll just render this. You will see the compositor is gonna kick in at the end. Watch. Boom, and that's bloom. Now this bloom, what's gonna happen, right? It's going to extend outside sometimes, okay? Outside the object. It's gonna create like an invisible barrier or like a boundary, and it's gonna affect negatively your selection. So you wanna remove this bloom from equation and render without bloom, right? So you wanna turn it off, and sometimes you wanna cut out without a bloom. So you might need as many sometimes as 3 or even more renders. Okay, I'm usually having like at least 2 renders. One render is just not enough. You see, now this one is gonna be denoised, but there's gonna be no bloom. Okay, so there you go. There is a denoiser kicking in, and there is no bloom on the image. Actually, optics works pretty fine. Managed to render this in 17 seconds. This is pretty good considering the scene is quite heavy. Another tip I can give you is that you should be rendering in viewport. So here, look at my usage of my VRAM. It's 2.2 gigabytes out of 24 gigabytes, right? But look what happens when I'm going to go to cycles view. Okay, when I switch to cycles, all right, my VRAM usage jumps up by 4 gigabytes. So if your card struggles during render, if you don't have enough VRAM, turn off this render view. And if it doesn't pop back to a lower value, it means that it's simply not clearing the VRAM on your card. So you need to close Blender and reopen it again, and it's gonna reset that value. Okay, this is a tip for rendering very heavy scenes when you have to go to the regular view just to be able to render. I do have scenes which take 23 gigabytes out of 24, and I'm unable to render it even with 390. So I need to go to my viewport view here, to the viewport shading, to be actually able to render it as seen in cycles, because remember that card usage is gonna increase during rendering as well. So that's just the preview usage, not rendering usage. Computer uses power when it's rendering as well, so remember that. And because you're using GPU compute, that's gonna add to it, so it's gonna be a cumulative effect. Okay, so just remember that. So the last thing, how do you set the camera with machine tools, guys? It's really easy. Let me turn this off. If I was setting camera here and I just, let's say chose my angle, let's say this one, that's actually pretty cool as well. Let's press page down, and we're gonna click on smart come to view. But because I already have a camera in view in my blend scene, I'm gonna hold Alt and click smart come to view, and that's gonna add a secondary camera. You see, now I got 2 cameras, okay, in view. So I got one here, and I can jump between them very easily. This is also a very interesting angle. It maybe could be a little bit closer. So page down and then lock to view, hold Control, middle mouse button, and zoom in. And this also could be, an interesting angle. Maybe slightly from the bottom like this, something like that. We could even cut these fins a little bit like this. This is quite aggressive as well. The lighting is going to be a bit different. The only problem is we have a lot of space here, but you could, for example, create a planet. Add a planet, very blurry planet, or some text on the drone. So it really depends on what you want to achieve, right? What you want to achieve. Now, what I don't like about this angle is that I can see the tiny bit overlap in here, this bright spot here. You see that annoys me, so I'm gonna hold this and just rotate this a little bit like that, and maybe separate it somewhat from the background, and drop it a bit down like this. There you go. Then maybe I need to decide whether I want to hide this rotor behind or want to show it. I think I want to show a bit of this backline here, because it's interesting, and that's actually better framing. So you need to look at every single element. This one is sticking out here a bit. We could remove it in Photoshop, or we could simply rotate camera a bit to the right to clean it here, and that's even better. And this one now, it's a bit flat and doesn't really show any depth. So we could just do something like this, and you could show a little bit of depth here. So like I said, there's a lot of elements to be taken into consideration. We get less spacing here than here. That's good. We could drop it just tiny bit lower. It's gonna be, I think, better. We could create a second save. I can give you this one as well. So we're gonna have 65 render course 2, and I'm gonna create one more for you guys. It's gonna be, you know, high angle. We could also change angle here if you wanted to, but this one is with the default 50 mil. So that's our default angle, 50 mil. Let's render this, see how we're gonna look. Now another thing is that's important, when you change angle, okay, we didn't change it drastically, but when you change angle of your camera, remember to adjust your lighting, because lighting could look very differently in a, you know, different angle camera. So we didn't really change the direction of the camera, we simply zoom in because we move closer with the camera and it's still from the same side. But if I was shooting from a different side or from the top, I would need to reconsider my framing, okay? So that's really, really important. And now let's see what optics is doing. Yeah, see, that's why I have beef with optics, because it just sometimes does this, you know. I'm gonna close it and reopen it. This is why I prefer to use CUDA, because I can't be bothered with, you know, dealing with this Blender buggy optics drama. It really just doesn't matter if I render in 20 seconds or 15. It's no difference for me. So it's a good thing I actually rendered this. I mean, I actually saved this. So I'm gonna switch back to my CUDA here and simply render with these settings, and it's gonna be no problem, I'm guessing. There we go. So CUDA is, so optics is still not there, and you see that it's gonna be a little bit longer, about 3 minutes, which is not terrible. So I'm just gonna simply let it render, and I'll see you in a minute. Okay, we're back. We're waiting for the compositor to kick in. It wasn't actually too bad, about 2.5 minutes. Another thing we need to talk about is reflections. You see that here in the eyes we have reflections of the trees. Because you remember, if you have something glossy, it will reflect the environment. Like here, you can see that we have reflections of clouds, and so on and so forth. I wonder why my bloom didn't kick in. Let me see that. Compositing. Ah, yes, bloom wasn't turned on. Alright, waiting for the bloom to kick in. Boom, there we go, that's better. Now you see that the focal length changes the way model looks. It's less compressed, more kind of distorted towards us, kind of like bent towards us. And also we are seeing a different sort of angle of everything. If I change this, right, if I'm gonna save that, so let's save that, 65.2, okay, I will know what it is. If I'm gonna change the focal length on this one, so let's go to layout, let's grab this this camera and let's go here and let's change it to 135, okay, and I'm going to move it backwards. So we lock the view, so let's just simply move back. You'll see that we're going to be seeing a very different, very different perspective of this model. Let's actually make it a bit more dramatic. So let's go to, let's say 300, which is going to be really orthographic, okay? It's like almost orthographic basically. And then with this, right, you can allow yourself for a slightly different crop. So you can see that there is a different perspective here on the rotor. You can see more of that, more of the bottom, because the compression allows you to simply put more information into the frame. So it's just, it's up to, it depends on what you're going for, right? It depends on what you're going for, what kind of feeling you're going for. So you need to play with these values and see what works for you. It's just basically down to a personal style. This would conclude our lesson on rendering. I hope it helps you out. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the editing part.